The nation of Krakoa is arguably the greatest achievement in all of mutant history. One island, one land for all mutant kind outside of the oppression of humanity. Of course, this was a massive undertaking, and getting to this point was no small task. Mutant kind had faced trials for decades upon decades thanks to their mere existence, but usually had tried to handle them in the context of humanity, be that through peaceful or violent means. Krakoa was the end of all that. The mutants would split, forge their own path in the world for all mutant kind regardless of who they were before. This was a new direction, and the new direction demanded leaders. Those leaders were named the Quiet Council, and it was under their guidance that Krakoa would bloom and eventually fall. But who were the Council? Which mutants were deemed important enough to guide such a powerful force? That is what we are here to talk about today. Let's get started with a history of the Quiet Council of Krakoa. The original formation of the Quiet Council actually wasn't as complicated of a process as you might think. I mean, in universe, it was a huge deal, and I'm sure there was a lot of debate that went into it, but also, there's not a comic book that's just hours of Professor X and Magneto debating which candidates to select. By the time that we first see the Quiet Council assembled, their roster is already complete, and consists of 12 core members, 2 adjunct members, and 4 separate officials, bringing the total to 16. We'll begin by breaking down the core 12, though even this section is broken up into smaller categories. Typically, when the council meets, they sit at this big round table that's actually 4 tables. Because look, it's an X, see? Because of X-Men and the X gene, because the table is an X, see? Get it? Jokes aside though, there's actually a very good lore reason why they're divided into groups of 3 like this. One of the main goals of the Quiet Council was to appeal to all mutants. Krakoa was supposed to be a nation for all of them regardless of allegiance, and so the council should have members representing everybody. To that end, each member appointed was important to mutant kind in one way or another, and the 4 different categories were 4 different forms that the importance took. The tables were named after seasons. The Autumn Table consisted of members who had traditionally led mutant kind, though the exact way they led could vary quite substantially. This quarter consisted of, unsurprisingly, Professor X and Magneto, and a little bit more surprisingly, Apocalypse. Apocalypse was, after all, one of the oldest mutants on Earth, dating all the way back to ancient Egypt, and he had been leading his own mutant groups ever since. His inclusion at this table also served a very important purpose. It showed that there was no singular ideology which could define a seat at the Quiet Council. I mean, sure, Charles Xavier and Magneto definitely have differing viewpoints, but especially in modern canon, they aren't as far away from each other as you might think. Apocalypse, though, is a lot more extreme, and also represents an arcane side of mutantdom that the other 2 don't really get into. Next, we move on to the Summer Table, and no, despite his last name, Cyclops is ironically not here, though don't worry Cyclops fans, he does have a role within the council that we'll get to later. Still, even without him, the Summer Table can best be described as essentially the X-Men table. While the previous one was leaders of mutant kind who were very much leading from the top of the hierarchy, these were leaders who were out in the field fighting for justice and protecting people. Their original lineup was Nightcrawler, Storm, and Jean Grey, and as you might be able to guess from that roster, this is the table which is meant to be the most heroic, essentially aspirational for the other mutants, people that they could look up to who were closer to them than a Professor X or a Magneto. And once again, it proves a very important point about the Council's fundamental nature, which is that the power level of a member's mutation was not factored in when chosen. I mean, look here, at this table we have Nightcrawler sitting next to Storm. Now, I'm not a power scaling type, but Storm is stronger than Nightcrawler. Fortunately, in this case, that doesn't matter at all, because what matters is effective leadership. Both Storm and Nightcrawler are good at inspiring mutants under them and being calm in a crisis, and that's the kind of thing that gets them this ranking. Now, you'll note that I'm not doing these in chronological season order, rather I'm doing them in order of complexity, kind of, and you will see that the vibe definitely shifts as we move on to the Table of Winter. This one is maybe a little bit more unsavory, though I suppose that word depends on your personal point of view, but I think you'll get what I mean. The seats at this table were held by Mystique, Mr. Sinister, and Exodus, and those 3 have less of a clear theme other than just villains, but that's not the idea that they were going for in universe, so let's go through each of them really quickly. Mystique brings a unique voice to the council because she's the only member who could really qualify as a quote-unquote spy. She also has a very long-standing allegiance with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, which is a far more extreme mutant organization. Mr. Sinister is a unique case, as he's the only character we're going to be talking about today that is not a natural-born mutant. His mutant genes were inserted into himself later artificially, but this is kind of also why he got onto the council. Not to represent artificial mutanthood, but because of his mastery of their genetics. I mean, Sinister's whole thing is that he really, genuinely understands how the X gene works, and he can tweak it with science to make it do what he wants. For a nation of mutants, that is definitely somebody whose resources you're going to want to have access to, even if their methods are not often the most ethical. And finally, Exodus, the most open mutant supremacist on the council. He was born in 12th century France, he actively participated in the Crusades, his powers are enhanced by the faith of the people around him, and his name is Exodus, for God's sake. He is basically a religious figure. Though his beliefs have shifted a bit over the years, which is often a point of his character, Exodus typically believes that mutants are genuinely just better than humanity, to such an extent that humanity should be eradicated so that mutants can take over. Think kind of like Magneto, but less motivated by ideals of protection and more by religious fanaticism. In fact, in his earlier days, that is exactly what he was. He has been an acolyte of Magneto before, but would later go on to lead his own groups of acolytes. So with these members, the Winter Table definitely seems a little less stable than the other two that we've talked about so far, but there is a connecting through line between them, that being their extremism. It is an undeniable truth that mutant kind has faced a lot of trials over the course of their existence, and that means that, ethical or not, these extremist ideologies are part of their history that cannot be ignored. Since the Quiet Council was meant to be a unifying body for all mutants regardless of their personal beliefs or ideology, that meant that extreme stances had to have representatives as well, and this was the purpose of the Winter Table. And that brings us to the final quarter of the council, the Spring Table. There's a very good reason why I saved this one for last, and that's because it operates quite differently to the others. While the other three are more based around ideology, this one is purely economic. In fact, this group has another name outside of their Quiet Council status, that being the Hellfire Trading Company. This table is run by Emma Frost. Now, Emma's history is a whole other thing that I don't have time to get into today, but she came up in a group known as the Hellfire Club, which originally was a sort of Illuminati-like organization of very rich people in which membership was passed down through ancestry. However, largely thanks to the actions of Emma and her collaborator on this team, Sebastian Shaw, it became more of a mutant organization. As the newly rebranded Hellfire Trading Company, the Hellfire Club had something very important to offer Krakoa as a nation, because after all, that is what Krakoa was at the end of the day. It wasn't just a bunch of mutants hanging out, it was a nation in the world and thus subject to geopolitics. All that to say, the point of the Spring Table is trade. As leader of the Hellfire Trading Company, Emma was given a seat on the council so that she could help facilitate the island's economics through her own private company. This, of course, is a lot more interesting and comic booky in practice than it actually might sound. There's a whole plot that goes on in the early days of Krakoa about the fact that they developed drugs which could cure basically any disease, and used these as leverage to gain legitimacy in the eyes of other human nations. Emma was in charge of distributing those drugs. And of course, it's Emma Frost. She was not going to be content with just one seat, and so she negotiated, gaining control of the entire table. At her side is her frequent collaborator Sebastian Shaw, who was in charge of black market distribution and operations, and more surprisingly, Kitty Pryde. Kitty, or Kate as she was going by at the time, had a whole weird thing happening where her powers interacted weirdly with the portals that mutants used to access Krakoa. Basically, her powers wouldn't let her use the portals to access Krakoa, and that meant if she wanted to come and go, she had to get to the island by sea. Recognizing the potential in this situation, Emma appointed Kate specifically as the captain of a newly formed group known as the Marauders, whose job was rescuing mutants from nations who did not recognize Krakoan sovereignty. So to break this table down again, Emma's job was handling legitimate above-the-table dealings, Sebastian's job was handling illegitimate under-the-table dealings, and if those kind of things went wrong, then Kate and the Marauders would go and get the mutants from that area so they wouldn't be persecuted. Also, they still do use the Hellfire Club naming distinctions even on the council. Emma Frost is the White Queen, and Sebastian Shaw is the Black King. And just to be clear, because people are always confused by this, These are names after chess pieces. It's a whole hierarchy that was established decades ago. It's not referencing anything else. It's chess pieces. They do extend it for the Krakoa era by adding a red set, though. This is what Kate fell into. She was the Red Queen. And with this, the original core 12 of the Quiet Council are established. We'll go on to the others in a second, but since these are the most important, let's recap exactly what the tables are for. The Autumn Table is leadership, those who have guided mutant kind from the top in a large-scale way. The Spring Table is economics, Emma Frost and the Hellfire Club in charge of trade relations. The Winter Table contains representatives of extremist ideologies, those that are more controversial but undeniable as a part of mutant history, and the Summer Table is their opposite, containing more just, heroic, aspirational ideologies. Now, before we get to what the council did, let's really quickly go over the remaining 6 members. Most of these are pretty simple and practical, so it shouldn't take long. The next 2 are a pair, essentially adjunct members, who are on the council in some capacity because, well, Krakoa itself is alive. Like, the island is a sentient, conscious being, and it wouldn't really be fair to have people living on it without giving that island some representation. The other half of this pairing is the mutant named Cypher. Cypher's power is pretty fascinating. He has the ability to instantaneously and perfectly comprehend language. All languages and in any form, including things like sign language, even body language. Thus, he was given adjunct member status not because he's a leader of mutant kind, but because he is one of the few people who can reliably communicate with Krakoa. I mean, nobody else really speaks island, and so that's why he's there. Plus, it is very useful for a government body to have a perfect translator on hand. I imagine that comes in handy all the time. Now we reach the final 4 members of the Quiet Council, the Great Captains of Krakoa, typically just called the War Captains. As the name very heavily implies, this is the Krakoan military. Though to be fair, they are less like a traditional military and more like the leaders of superhero teams. After all, this is a sci-fi superhero-y type government where everybody on the nation has superpowers, so they don't really need a standing military in the sense that human nations do. As I'm sure many of you can probably guess, this is where Cyclops makes his council appearance. Actually, he was the first captain commander of this group, which is technically the highest ranking among these 4, and his jurisdiction was over the X-Men teams. Next was Magic, whose longtime role in the New Mutants kind of serves to further her jurisdiction. She was in charge of any team that was dealing with the younger generation of mutants, as well as helping to train them. Then we have Bishop, the second Captain Commander after Cyclops stepped down from the post. Bishop is in charge of security for the Marauders and the Hellfire Company. And finally, Gorgon, definitely the most obscure character among the captains. He is a mutant with the ability to turn people into stone via eye contact, much like Medusa, which is where he gets his name from. Rather than being assigned to a specific team, his role as a captain was head of security and bodyguard for the members of the Quiet Council themselves. However, after a complicated magical incident left him with a very unstable mental state, he was unable to perform this job and was succeeded by Psylocke, Quanon Psylocke for anyone who's curious. And with the captains addressed, we have covered every member of the original Quiet Council. These 16 mutants would set the destiny, foreshadowing very much intended, of the newly formed mutant nation going forward. Now, it should be noted that the Quiet Council is not the entire extent of the Krakoan government. There are other agencies that the Quiet Council appointed, so we'll run through those really quickly just for the sake of mentioning them. There was a new iteration of X-Force during the Krakoa era, and this one was basically the Krakoan equivalent of the CIA. They were a Black Ops intelligence agency run by Beast. I'm sure some of you were wondering what he was doing. It was this. The new version of X-Factor was also formed by the Council. This team was basically a detective agency. Their job was to investigate mutant murders. At this point, you can probably gather that most of these agencies are reusing names from older teams, and that pattern will continue for the next one, which is the latest iteration of SWORD. Yeah, I know SWORD is also a thing in the MCU now, but that one is a very, very different SWORD. This one stands for Sentient World Observation and Resource Department, and it's basically the Mutant Space Program. The Marvel Wiki also lists the Hellions as a Quiet Council formed team, which I guess is technically true, though it was really just Mr. Sinister who did this. He took a bunch of mutants who were erratic and unpredictable and said, hey, I can just kind of unify these guys into a team that I can manage so they'll be productive. And, you know, that went great, because giving Mr. Sinister charge of a team always goes well. Finally, while I don't technically think this group is under the direct jurisdiction of the Council in a government agency type of way, I should briefly address the Five. Arguably the biggest hallmark of the Krakoa era is the fact that mutants were immortal during it, and the way they were immortal was thanks to these 5 mutants, whose powers combined could resurrect anyone from death. I'm gonna do a whole video about this, because it's a complicated topic, and I've decided to break the Krakoa stuff up into separate videos. Usually I don't do that, I like doing one big deep dive on things, but a lot of people have been asking for a singular Krakoa deep dive. And I don't think you guys understand how big of an undertaking that would be. It would be like 3-4 hours at minimum, and I don't have an editor. I'm a one-man show over here, so I can't really do that. I'm going to instead tackle big Krakoan topics in their own individual things, and that'll also make it easier to navigate. So I won't address the 5 now, but do look for a video on that coming in the future. There is a very good reason why I had to at least quickly touch on the whole mutant resurrection immortality thing, and that's because it is very relevant to the next Quiet Council topic, the Pit of Exile. There are a lot of evil mutants out there, a lot of supervillains have mutant status, and even though many of them were willing to join and integrate into Krakoa because it was a nation for all of them, there would always be those more unpredictable types which would not do that. And how do you punish them in a lasting way when they could just get immediately resurrected? This is a heavy topic. I mean, all of Krakoa was kind of full of heavy topics, but for my channel especially, so we are just going to hit on it very quickly. But capital punishment doesn't work if people just get brought back to life, and this is what the Pit of Exile was for. It was basically a stasis chamber where those who broke the laws of Krakoa beyond rehabilitation just got thrown and abandoned. Now, no one is claiming that this is necessarily the most ethical thing, but that's also kind of the point. The Krakoa era was rife with these ethical debates, and the Pit of Exile was very much one of them. So now that raises a question. I mentioned the laws of Krakoa. And what are those? I mean, it's the Quiet Council's job to establish the rules of the nation that they govern, so it's very much a topic I want to cover today. And also, they're kind of funny. The laws of Krakoa are quite simple, actually. In fact, there's only 3 of them. Mutant ethics are a topic that we've had to hit briefly a couple times in this video already, so I think it's clear that this is a topic which would be debated a lot in universe. There's a whole branch of the government dedicated to representing extremist ideals, so that shouldn't come as a surprise. With this in mind, wanting to be free of the old laws of man and establish a new era of law for mutant kind, the council decided to go simple. Therefore, Krakoa's 3 laws are: number 1, make more mutants, number 2, murder no man, and number 3, respect this sacred land. The first one is the one that makes it a little bit funny because, well, I'm not gonna go into detail on the mechanics because this is meant to be a relatively kid-friendly video, but you make more mutants one way. And it is wild that that is enshrined within Krakoan law. The reason that this happens is actually because of Nightcrawler's religious beliefs. He cites a Bible passage about being fruitful and multiplying. As for how this law is really enforced, don't worry about it. They don't really address that because once you start looking into it more, it does become really weird. Just kind of treat it as it is and don't think about it a lot. That's what the comics do. The second law is very obvious. Murder no man. Murder is generally a bad thing. The only thing I have to note here is that in this case, man is specifically referring to human, because killing another mutant wasn't actually banned by Krakoan law. I mean, it was obviously frowned upon in the wrong circumstances, but later in the Krakoa era, there's a whole religious ritual around mutants killing each other. They get wild with it because, I mean, they could resurrect from the dead. It wasn't that big of a deal. Then the third law, respect this sacred land, is also fairly straightforward, but I do like the origin of it. There is a whole scene in the first Krakoa era comic where we get to see these laws being debated, and this one comes about because Sebastian Shaw, the super capitalist, starts talking about things like property rights, and then, very much earning his spot in that room, Cypher speaks up on behalf of Krakoa and says, hey, maybe we shouldn't talk about property rights because this island is a living thing. This, of course, sparks a larger conversation, and the council eventually lands on respect to this sacred land as a sort of twofold law. One, it is for the preservation of the nation and its environment, but also it's a way to respect Krakoa's status as an entity. At this point, having addressed both the members of the council and their functions for the nation of Krakoa, I think I've talked about everything that I need to for the first iteration at least. Unsurprisingly, the council did go through some membership changes, and I should address those, though there might not be as many as you'd think. Some of you definitely knew what I was meaning by this, but remember how I said the word destiny was obvious foreshadowing earlier? Yeah, Destiny is the next person to take up a council seat. This is going to be a very quick summary of a very big Krakoan plot, but essentially, the nation was ultimately doomed to fail at some point in the future. Krakoa was never going to last forever, at least not in the form that it took at the time of the Council's formation. Professor X knew this, but he didn't want knowledge of that to be extremely public, so he forbid any mutant with precognitive abilities from being resurrected. Destiny was one of these. She had the power to see the future. And she was also Mystique's wife, so therefore Mystique was not very happy about not only her wife not being resurrected, but also Charles being very cryptic about the whole thing. So Mystique begins working on her own plan from the shadows, and after Apocalypse resigns from the council to go live with his family in another dimension, man, I love that my job lets me say things like that casually, Mystique proposes Destiny as a replacement for his seat. This was very controversial and came as a shock to Charles because Destiny was very much alive, but her revival had not been approved. Mystique had actively gone behind his back to resurrect her wife. And being Mystique, she was too smart to just let that happen without any other backing plan, so before she had proposed Destiny as a replacement, she had already talked to and gotten votes secured from enough council members to make the appointment happen. This left the council at 11 members, and yes, I know that math doesn't really add up, but there's a kind of weird dynamic that happens here, because Jean Grey is the first member to resign, then Apocalypse resigns, then Apocalypse's seat is filled, and then Jean Grey's seat is filled. So I kind of had the choice to either present this in the order of people who left or people were appointed, and I decided to go with the second. Jean resigned because she didn't like the control that the council had over the X-Men. She didn't want them to be a military quote-unquote organization, so she leaves and then helps Cyclops perform them more independently. Her seat is then filled by Colossus, so their table keeps the theme of former X-Men members who are aspirational. I mean, Colossus is great at that kind of thing. The third seat shift starts with another resignation, this time by Magneto, but it rapidly turns into something way more dramatic because Selene is the first person suggested to fill his slot. For those who don't know, Selene is a very evil mutant lady. She's basically like a magic mutant succubus, and thus her candidacy, despite her immortality and years of experience, is quickly denied in favor of Hope Summers. Hope is a very important figure to mutant history, being the first mutant born after Scarlet Witch did the No More Mutants thing and removed the vast majority of mutant powers from the planet. Thus, a lot of people, Exodus included, see her as the mutant messiah in a way. This, however, was not the thing that got her the seat on the council, or at least not exclusively. The higher factor was the fact that she is a very important member of the Five, that little pseudo-team of mutants that runs the resurrection protocols I mentioned earlier. This is the stage where the Five gets more official representation within the Krakoan government. They were always very important to everything operating correctly, and in fact, that's actually Hope's whole argument. Since the Five are necessary for Krakoan society to function the way it does, they should have a seat on the council. Now, some of you might be wondering why I even bothered mentioning Selene if she doesn't end up getting the slot, and it's because she's very, very bitter about it. She wants to be on the Quiet Council, and so purely out of spite, she animates a giant monster and sends it to attack Krakoa. Hope ends up killing her, she gets revived because that's what happens during this era, and then Exodus uses his incredible psionic abilities to suppress her and force her to stop the monster that's attacking everybody. This is very relevant later though, it's not just her being bitter about losing an election. Because, she doesn't let this go, and would stay bitter about it until the final days of Krakoa, where she becomes the last appointed member. The slot that she fills is the one previously held by Mr. Sinister, because surprise surprise, the guy literally named Mr. Sinister was actually working on his own plot the entire time using the Quiet Council resources, and when this was discovered, which was a whole thing in and of itself, he was ousted. Sebastian Shaw then once again proposes Selene as a new member of the council, largely due to the fact that she is a former member and collaborator with Shaw at the Hellfire Club. This time around, she wins. She wins because she cheated, in fairness. They end up tipping the scales in her favor because Colossus was under some weird reality warping mind control at the time, but regardless, Selene is on the council now for a fairly brief time as Krakoa would fall soon after. Though, to be more specific, the Quiet Council would actually not even make it all the way to Krakoa's final days. Remember how I said that Mr. Sinister was actually working on his own plans the entire time? That would be the thing that took the Quiet Council down, though not because of his plans directly. While his scheme ultimately failed, it came very close to succeeding, and through that process revealed that Sinister potentially could have bent all of the Quiet Council to his will, essentially becoming a strange sort of dictator. And then from dictator to super god robot entity, this is complicated. I did already do a video on it though, so you can go check that out if you want. Complexity of this aside, it gets so incredibly close to disaster that the Quiet Council rules they cannot keep it to themselves and inform the residents of Krakoa about what almost happened. While this was the honest thing to do, it had the unfortunate side effect of pretty much destroying all faith in the council, as Mr. Sinister was elected fairly and had been on there since the beginning. Since he was apparently evil the entire time, it is understandable how the nation no longer trusted their leaders, and the entire society almost collapsed. To avoid any more irreversible disaster, the council votes to disband themselves, paving the way for a new form of government, which admittedly would not get very far, as Krakoa would meet disaster after disaster in the coming year until its eventual destruction. Or ascension, I guess, depending on who you ask. Like I said, Krakoa is super strange, but the point is, it wasn't around anymore. And thus the days of the Quiet Council come to an end, with a final roster that's actually a lot more similar to the original than I would have originally predicted. They weren't necessarily a stable leadership, but they did the job for quite a few years. I should mention, just for the sake of completeness, that there is technically still an organization in the Marvel Universe called the Quiet Council of Krakoa, but they have no actual ties to the original Krakoan Quiet Council. Rather, this is a mutant terrorist group that arose in the ashes of Krakoa and is just taking that name because they believe that Krakoa should not have fallen. Every single time I dive back into the mechanics of the Krakoa era for a video, I am amazed by how much lore and world building went into this period of mutant kind. It is truly impressive how big of an initiative this was. And I'm sure that for better or for worse, this video left a lot of you, especially the sci-fi politics nerds, with more questions than answers. But as I mentioned about halfway through, this is only one piece of a very, very large puzzle that is the Krakoa era. And I will make good on my promise to continue doing videos on bits and pieces of this in the coming months. It really is a fascinating topic. It's just not an easy one to hit all at once. For purposes of today's video though, I did think that the Quiet Council deserved an early spotlight on these Krakoa topics because man, they're really cool. They're such an interesting narrative study on flawed government and how these dynamics of people in charge work, especially when you're dealing with the unique case of a mutant nation. There are so many great philosophical questions raised by the existence of the council. Should an entire nation be led by such a small group of people? How much value does seniority have when it comes to government positions? And maybe most importantly, is representation of extremism in government valid for the sake of that representation? Do I have definitive answers for any of these deep questions? No. I talk about comic books on the internet, but I do acknowledge that a lot of them are uncomfortably relevant in today's situations. Though perhaps uncomfortably is the wrong word, because that is ultimately what these kind of comic books are about and have always been about. The X-Men have inherently been a political series and team for the entirety of their history. Some people want to deny it, but it's objectively true, and the Quiet Council is just a manifestation of that in a far more literal sense. It's a group that gets you thinking, and they do that extremely well. So if anybody tries to tell you that comic books are only for kids, show them this video and see if it changes their minds. Thank you all so much for watching. I do hope that you enjoyed this video. I'll keep the ending announcements very quick today because there's nothing really new, but I do want to shout out my Patreon supporters, as is the latest development to happen on this channel. If you are already subscribed to my Patreon, I really do appreciate you. Thank you so much. It helps a lot in supporting my content. And if you're not subscribed to it, check it out. You can find a link in my bio on my channel page. My username there is also the exact same as it is here. If you go to my Patreon, you can get early ad-free access to all of my long-form videos and a bonus Patreon exclusive video every month. Finally, as always, shout out to Ruben Perez, who drew the avatar that you've been watching talk at you for the last 26 minutes or so. He does a great job. Go check out his work. As for me, well, it's about 5 a.m. when I'm finishing this recording, and unlike the Mutants of Krakoa, I will not get resurrected if I die, so I'm gonna do the healthy thing and go get some sleep. See you next time.